My father raised his champagne glass in front of 300 people at his retirement dinner, looked directly at me, and said that his one great regret in life was that his daughter had thrown herself away on a nobody. A nobody. He said it into a microphone, in a ballroom full of his colleagues, his board, and everyone who had ever mattered to him. And 300 people laughed softly, the way people laugh when a powerful man makes a cruel joke and they are afraid not to. My husband Ben sat next to me, quiet as always, in the one good suit he owned, and he did not flinch. He just reached under the table and took my hand. And I sat there, 33 years old, and felt myself turn back into a small girl who could never, ever be enough for Roger Whittaker. That was the moment my father humiliated me, on purpose, in front of the whole world, on what was supposed to be the proudest night of his life. He had no idea it was about to become the worst. Because about 20 minutes after he called my husband a nobody, my quiet Ben stood up, buttoned his cheap jacket, and revealed who he really was. And I watched every drop of color drain out of my father's face. My name is B, and this is the story of the night the man everyone underestimated turned out to be the only one in the room who actually mattered. If you have ever been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to love you, stay with me right to the end of this one. Go ahead and hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Let me take you back. My father is Roger Whittaker, and to understand this night, you have to understand that my father worshipped exactly one thing his whole life: success that other people could see. He built Whitaker Manufacturing from a small machine shop into one of the biggest industrial parts makers in the region, and he was genuinely brilliant at it, and he never once let anyone forget it. To my father, a person's worth was a number: your salary, your title, the price of your car, the size of your house. That was the entire scoreboard, and he kept score on everyone, including his own children. I can tell you the exact day I learned where I ranked. I was 9, and I had won the school spelling bee, this little gold trophy, and I ran home so proud I could barely breathe. And my father looked at it and asked me how many kids had been in the competition. And I said 40, and he nodded and said 40. So you beat 39 children at spelling. And that was it. No hug, no good job, just a head count. That same week, my brother flipped a used car for a $400 profit, and my father took the whole family out to a steak dinner to celebrate his son, the entrepreneur. $400 got a steak dinner. First place out of 40 got a head count. I was 9, and I did the math the way my father taught everyone to do the math, and I understood that in our house, spelling did not have a dollar sign, so it did not count. I stopped bringing home trophies after that. Not because I stopped winning them, because I finally understood he was never going to look at them. And by that scoreboard, I was a disappointment from the day I decided what I wanted to do with my life. Because I became a teacher, a second-grade teacher. I stand in a room full of 7-year-olds every day, and I teach them to read and to add and to be kind to each other. And I love it more than I have ever loved anything except my husband. And to my father, that made me a failure. He never said it in those exact words, not for years. He said it in 1,000 smaller ways. At family dinners, he would ask my cousin about his law firm and my brother about his portfolio, and then he would turn to me and say, "And how are the little ones, B?" in the voice you use for a child's hobby. He introduced me at his parties as my daughter, the teacher, and somehow he made those 4 words sound like an apology. For 33 years, I tried to earn a look from my father that I never once got, and I told myself it did not matter, and it always mattered, because that is how it works with a parent, no matter how old you get. And then I brought home Ben. I met Ben 6 years ago, and I want to tell you exactly who he seemed to be, because it is the whole heart of this story. Ben was quiet. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, he wore the same brown jacket for years, and he ate at diners, and when you asked him what he did for work, he would just say, "Oh, I am in investments, a little of this and that," and then he would change the subject and ask about you. He was the kind of man who remembered the name of every waitress, who helped strangers carry things, who listened more than he talked. He was the kindest, steadiest, most genuinely content human being I had ever met, and I fell in love with him so fast it scared me. I will tell you the exact moment I knew I would marry him. It was our third date at a little diner, and an older woman 2 booths over could not pay her bill. She was embarrassed, counting change, and the waitress was getting impatient, and it was becoming a scene. And Ben got up quietly and walked over, and I could not hear what he said, but he covered her whole bill and a little extra, and he did it in a way that made her feel like she had done him a favor by letting him. And then he came back and picked up our conversation exactly where he had left off, like nothing had happened. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. He did not tell me about it. I only knew because I had been watching. And I thought, I have dated men who would have made sure the entire restaurant saw them tip well. This one did a genuinely kind thing and then did not even want the credit for it. That is when I knew. Not because he had money, I did not even know yet how much he had, because he was the first person I had ever met whose goodness did not need an audience. And I had grown up in a house where nothing counted unless there was an audience. Ben was the opposite of everything my father taught me to want, and that is exactly why he was everything I actually needed. And my father took one look at him and wrote him off in about 4 seconds, because Ben did not perform. Ben did not walk into a room and announce his salary. Ben did not have a flashy car or a loud watch or a title that impressed people at parties. And to a man who kept score the way my father did, a quiet man in a brown jacket was, by definition, a nobody. The first time I brought Ben to dinner, my father spent the whole night talking over him, and afterward he pulled me into the kitchen and asked me, with real concern, whether I was sure about this, because a woman could love a man and still want a life with some ambition in it. Ambition. He said it about the most quietly ambitious man I have ever known. But my father could not see it because my father only knew how to see one kind of ambition, the loud kind, and Ben's ambition never made a sound. It got worse the longer we were married, not better. At every family gathering, my father found a small way to remind Ben and everyone else exactly where Ben ranked. He would ask Ben in front of people, "So, Ben, are you still doing the investing thing? Is that going anywhere?" in the tone you use for a nephew's garage band. One Thanksgiving, my father was handing out his expensive cigars to the men after dinner, going around the whole table, my brother, my cousin, my uncle, and he simply skipped Ben, walked right past him, as if my husband were part of the furniture. Ben did not say a word. He just caught my eye across the table and gave me a tiny private smile, the one that said, "It is okay. I do not need his cigar." Another time, my father actually offered, in front of the whole family, to help Ben find something more stable, a real job with a real company, because he knew some people and he would hate to see me have to be the one carrying the household. Carrying the household. He said that to a man who could have bought and sold him 100 times over, and Ben just thanked him politely and said he would keep it in mind. I used to get so angry, and Ben would take my hand in the car afterward and say, "B, a man who needs everyone to know he is winning is not winning at anything that matters. Let him have his cigars." It took me years to understand that my husband was not being weak. He was being free. Here is what my father never bothered to find out because he had already decided Ben was beneath us. Ben was not a little of this and that. Ben had built from absolutely nothing a private investment firm called Ironwood Holdings. He started it in his 20s with a used laptop and a genius for seeing value where other people saw junk, and over 15 years he had grown it very quietly and very deliberately out of the spotlight into a firm that owned pieces of dozens of companies and was worth a staggering amount of money. Ben could have bought my father's entire company with what was in one of his smaller funds, and he told almost no one because Ben had grown up poor, and he had watched what money did to people who wore it on the outside, and he had decided a long time ago that he would rather be underestimated than admired. He used to say the most powerful position in any room is the one everybody ignores. I knew who Ben really was, of course. I married him. But we made a decision together early on that we would let my family think whatever they wanted to think, partly because it was none of their business, and partly, if I'm honest, because some quiet part of me wanted to see how they would treat a man they believed had nothing before they ever found out what he had. I found out. For 6 years, I found out, and it was ugly, and it hurt, and I never imagined it would all come to a head on the night my father retired. I want to pause here for 1 second. The stories like this one, where the person everybody looks down on turns out to be the one who mattered all along, I put on perfect revenge stories first and nowhere else. If you want to be here when the next one lands, go ahead and subscribe and turn on the bell. Now, let me take you to the dinner. My father announced his retirement in the spring and the sale of Whitaker Manufacturing along with it, and he decided to throw himself a retirement gala that people are still talking about. A grand ballroom downtown, 300 guests, a live orchestra, an ice sculpture of the company logo, the whole thing. It was, in every way, a monument to Roger Whittaker, built by Roger Whittaker, to celebrate Roger Whittaker, and I almost did not go. Ben and I talked about it for a long time because by then we both knew something that my father did not, something I will get to in a moment, and I was not sure I could sit through one more night of being the disappointment at his table. Because I knew by then that Ben's firm had bought my father's company. Ben had told me the night the deal closed, gently, watching my face, because he knew exactly what it meant. And he had asked me a question I have never forgotten. He said, "B, this is your father, so this is your call, not mine. I can keep this quiet forever if you want me to. We never have to say a word. Or, if he ever crosses a line he should not cross, I can end it. But you tell me which." He handed me that power, and he let it sit in my hands for months, and for months I chose to keep the peace, to protect my father, to hope. So when I walked into that ballroom, I was not a helpless woman waiting to be rescued by her husband. I was a woman holding a loaded truth and choosing, one more time, not to use it because some stubborn part of me still loved the man who kept hurting me. What happened at that dinner happened because my father finally pulled the pin himself. Ben did not take my power back from me that night. I had already decided, somewhere between the family photo and the microphone, that I was done. Ben just stood up half a second before I did. But in the end, I went because he was my father and because some stubborn little girl inside me still hoped that on the biggest night of his life, he might finally be kind to me. That was my mistake. And it started the second we walked in, because my father had seated us. He had seated his own daughter and her husband at table 19, in the very back near the kitchen doors, at the table where you put the people you were required to invite and hoped would not come. My cousin, the lawyer, was at table 2. My brother was at the head table. And B, the teacher, and her nobody husband were parked by the swinging kitchen doors where the waiters came in and out all night. Ben just smiled and pulled out my chair and said, "Best seat in the house, we get our food first." That is the kind of man he is. But I saw it for exactly what it was. My father had turned even the seating chart into a scoreboard, and he had put us last. And it kept going all night in 100 small ways. When the photographer came around for family photos, an assistant with a clipboard found me at table 19 and told me, apologetically, that the family portrait was just going to be my father, my brother, and the grandchildren to keep it, quote, clean. Just the family. I was standing right there. My own father had left me out of the family photo at his own retirement and had an assistant deliver the news so he would not have to. And when I went up front to at least say hello to him before the speeches, to be a good daughter, he was mid conversation with an investor, and he saw me coming, and he held up one finger without breaking his sentence, the way you tell a waiter to wait, and he kept talking, and after a full minute, I just turned around and walked back to the kitchen doors. Ben watched me come back, and he did not say anything. He just moved his chair a little closer to mine. By the time my father stood up to give his speech, I had already been made to feel, in about 9 separate small ways, exactly how little I counted. The nobody joke was not the first cut of the night. It was just the one he did with a microphone. The dinner went the way these things go, speech after speech about my father's genius, his vision, his legacy, and I clapped until my hands hurt, and I watched my father glow in a way he never once glowed at me. And then, near the end, he took the microphone for his own remarks. And he was warm and funny and gracious, and he thanked his board and his colleagues and his mentors, and then he got to family. He praised my brother's financial success at length. He praised my cousin, and then he found me at table 19 by the kitchen doors. And he raised his glass and he smiled and he said, "And of course, my daughter B. B marches to her own drummer, always has. She could have done anything, and she chose to teach other people's children in a little classroom, and, well," he said, and the whole room leaned in. "My one regret, if I'm being honest on a night like tonight, is that my little girl threw herself away on a man with no ambition, when she could have had the world. But B always did have a soft spot for strays." And the room laughed. 300 people, laughing softly at the teacher and her nobody husband, while my father beamed at his own joke. A soft spot for strays. He called my husband a stray into a microphone in front of the entire world, on the night he was supposed to be celebrating everything he had built. I want to tell you what happened inside me in that moment, because it is the part that matters most. I did not feel angry, not at first. I felt like I was 7 years old again. I felt every single time my father had made me feel small, all 33 years of it, land on me at once, and I felt my eyes fill, and I hated that they filled because the last thing I wanted was to cry at table 19 and prove that he could still reach all the way inside me and press the oldest bruise. And I thought about my classroom and the 22 7-year-olds who run to hug me every morning and the notes they write me with the letters backwards, and I thought, that is not nothing. That is not throwing my life away. That is the most important work there is, and my own father just called it a joke. And underneath the hurt, something else was rising. Something I had spent 33 years swallowing, because I was done. I was finally, completely done trying to earn the approval of a man who could stand in front of 300 people and mock his own daughter to get a laugh. I turned to Ben to tell him we were leaving, and I saw that my husband was already setting down his napkin. And he had a look on his face that I had only seen a few times in 6 years, a very calm, very quiet look, the look he gets right before he does something that changes everything. And he leaned over and he kissed my forehead and he whispered, "I love you and I am so sorry, but I am not going to sit here and let him do this to you one more time." And my husband, the nobody, the stray, stood up at table 19, and he began to walk toward the front of the room. Now, here is the thing my father did not know. Here's the thing I have to explain, because it is why that walk across the ballroom was the most powerful thing I have ever seen. 6 months earlier, when my father put Whitaker Manufacturing up for sale for his retirement, the winning bid, the one that beat out every other buyer, the one that gave my father his enormous payday and his legacy and his cushy lifetime consulting contract and the promise that the Whitaker name would stay on the building, came from a private equity firm, Ironwood Holdings. My father had spent months in meetings with Ironwood's executives, thrilled, bragging about the sophisticated investors who saw the genius of what he had built. He never once met the man who owned Ironwood because that man preferred to stay in the background, and my father never thought to ask who he was because my father was too busy being flattered. The man who owned Ironwood Holdings, the man who had just bought Whitaker Manufacturing, the man who now controlled my father's retirement package, his consulting contract, his legacy, and the name on the building he had spent 50 years putting it on was sitting at table 19 by the kitchen doors in a 10-year-old brown jacket. My father had just called the owner of his own company a stray, and that owner was walking calmly to the microphone. The room did not know what was happening yet. My father, confused, still smiling, tried to make a joke of it and said into the mic, "Well, it looks like Bee's husband has something to say. This should be interesting." And Ben reached the front, and my father, being my father, could not help himself, and he actually handed Ben the microphone with a little smirk, the way you hand a child a toy to keep them busy. Ben took it, and Ben, who is the least dramatic person I have ever known, did not raise his voice and he did not gloat, and that is exactly what made it so devastating. He said, "Thank you, Roger. I will only take a moment. I want to congratulate you on your retirement and on the sale of your company. It really is a remarkable thing you built." He said, "I have gotten to know it very well over the last 6 months." And then he paused and he let the room get very quiet and he said, "Because Ironwood Holdings is my company. I founded it, I own it, and last month Ironwood acquired Whitaker Manufacturing. Which means, Roger, as of the closing, I am the person your consulting contract reports to. I am the one who decides whether your name stays on that building. And I am the man you just called a stray in front of your entire company for the crime of loving your daughter. I have never heard a room go so silent so fast. 300 people who had just laughed at my husband turned, all at once, to look at my father, and my father's face did something I had never seen it do in 33 years. It fell, everything. The smugness, the confidence, the 50 years of keeping score just slid off his face and left something underneath that I almost did not recognize because I had never once seen it there before. Fear. My father looked at the quiet man in the brown jacket, the man he had seated by the kitchen doors, the man he had mocked into a microphone, and he understood all at once that he had just publicly humiliated the person who now held his entire legacy in his hands. And Ben, God bless him, was not cruel. He did not have to be. He simply said, "I am not going to make a scene at your retirement, Roger, because unlike some people, I do not think a man's worth is a number, and I do not enjoy humiliating people in front of a crowd. I learned a long time ago that the loudest man in the room is almost never the most important one." And then Ben looked out at all 300 of those guests and he said, "The thing I will love him for until the day I die." He said, "But I will not stand in a room and let anyone, including her own father, call my wife's life small. She teaches children to read. She shapes actual human beings. There is not a person in this ballroom, myself included, doing more important work than she is." And then he set down the microphone and he walked back to table 19 and he held out his hand to me. "I want you to know what the room did because it told me everything." My brother, the golden son at the head table, would not meet my eyes, and I understood in that moment that he had always known our father was cruel to me and had simply been grateful, his whole life, that it was me and not him. An old board member near the front actually started to clap once and caught himself. And the Ironwood executives my father had been so proud of all night, the sophisticated investors he had been bragging about, were in that room too, and they were looking at my father the way you look at a man who has just very publicly insulted his own new boss, because that is exactly what he had done, and everyone in that ballroom understood it now, except maybe my father himself, who was still standing at the front holding a champagne glass he had forgotten he was holding, in a room that was no longer his. It had stopped being his monument the second Ben said the word Ironwood. Now it was just 300 people watching a proud man realize he had spent his whole life measuring the wrong thing, and in the middle of all of it, my quiet husband was walking back to me with his hand out, not looking at a single one of them, only at me. And here is where I finally did the thing I should have done 20 years earlier. I stood up. And I did not run out crying, and I did not hide. I took my husband's hand, and then I looked down the length of that silent ballroom at my father. And for the first time in my entire life, I was not a small girl hoping for his approval. I did not need it anymore. And I said in a voice that carried because a teacher learns how to make her voice carry, Dad, for 33 years I tried to be something you could be proud of. And tonight you taught me the last lesson I needed. It was never going to happen because you only know how to be proud of a scoreboard, and I was never going to be a number. I am a teacher. I am proud of it. And I married the best man in this room, who you would have known was the best man in this room, if you had ever once bothered to look at a person instead of a price tag. Goodbye, Dad. Enjoy your retirement. And then my husband and I walked out of my father's monument to himself, together, past 300 stunned faces and out into the cool night air, and I felt something break off of me and float away that I had been carrying since I was 7 years old. We sat in Ben's 10-year-old truck in the parking garage for a while before we drove home, both of us just breathing. And I started to laugh, and then I started to cry, and then I did both at the same time, the way you do when something you have carried your whole life finally lets go. And Ben just held me across the bench seat of that old truck, the truck my father was so ashamed of, and he let me fall apart. After a while, I said, Why did you never tell him? All these years, you could have shut him up any day you wanted. Why did you let him treat you like that for 6 whole years? And Ben was quiet for a second, and then he said, Because I did not want a father in law who respected my bank account. I wanted to see if there was a man in there who could respect his own daughter without one. He said, I kept waiting for Roger to see you be, just once, to look at you teaching those kids and understand what he had. I was never protecting myself from him. I was giving him every chance in the world to be your dad. And he stopped taking those chances tonight, so I stopped giving them. And I sat in that old truck and understood that I had married a man who would be 10 times the father to our future children that my own father had ever been to me. And that was the moment the last piece of the little girl at table 19 finally grew up. Let me tell you where everyone landed, because I know you want to know. Ben, being a better person than I will ever be, did not strip my father of everything, even though he could have. He honored the sale, and he let my father keep the money he had earned over 50 years, because Ben genuinely believed my father had built something real and deserved to be paid for it. But the consulting contract, the lucrative multi-year deal that would have kept my father lording over that company as a highly paid advisor long after retirement, that quietly did not get renewed past its first review. And the Whitaker name. About a year later, when the building got a planned renovation, the sign came down and it did not go back up. My father, who worshipped a legacy other people could see, got to drive past the company he built for 50 years and watch his own name disappear from it, because the man he called a stray owned the wall. I drove past that building myself the day the sign came down. I did not plan to. My route to my classroom took me past it, and there was a crew up on a lift, unbolting the big steel letters that spelled Whitaker one at a time and setting them on the ground. And I pulled over and I sat in my car and I watched my father's name come off the building he had given his whole life to instead of giving it to us. And I want to be honest about what I felt because it was complicated. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a strange, aching sadness for a man who had spent 50 years believing that a name on a wall was the same thing as being loved, and who was going to spend his retirement finding out it was not. He could have had a daughter who adored him, and a son-in-law who respected him, and grandchildren who ran to hug his legs. He traded all of it for a scoreboard, and now even the scoreboard was coming down, one bolt at a time. I did not cry for myself, sitting in that car. I had already done that years ago. I cried a little for him. And then I wiped my face and drove to my classroom, where 22 children were waiting for someone who was glad to see them. And I was. My father reached out to me, of course, in the weeks after that dinner. Not with a real apology. With the closest thing he was capable of, which was a stiff, awkward phone call where he mentioned several times how well he now understood that Ben was a very impressive young man. Impressive. Now that Ben had a number my father could see, suddenly Ben was worth respecting. And I realized, listening to my father try to befriend my husband's bank account, that nothing had actually changed in him at all. He still only saw the scoreboard. He had just found out my husband was winning it. So I keep my distance now, and I have made my peace with it, and I want to tell you the part that surprised me most. It did not feel like revenge. Watching my father's face fall was satisfying for about 10 seconds, and then it just felt sad, because I finally understood that my father is a man who will die having never once known the difference between what a person is worth and what a person costs. The real ending is not what happened to him, it is what happened to me, Because the day after that dinner, I went back to my classroom to my 22 7-year-olds, and a little boy who has a hard time at home ran up and hugged my legs and told me I was his favorite grown up in the whole world. And I thought about a ballroom full of powerful people and an ice sculpture and a man who spent 50 years keeping score. And I thought, I would not trade this hug for that whole ballroom. And for the first time in my life, I completely, all the way down to the bottom, believed it. A few weeks later, that same little boy gave me a drawing. It was a stick figure of a woman standing in front of a chalkboard with a big lopsided heart over her head, and underneath, in wobbly 7-year-old letters, it said, Mrs. Ellis is the best. I have that drawing framed on my desk at home now. And sometimes I think about my father's ballroom, the orchestra, the ice sculpture, the 300 important people, and the name that used to be on the building and is not anymore. And then I look at that crayon drawing. Mrs. Ellis is the best, and I know with absolute certainty which one of us actually won. My father spent 50 years building a monument, and its own letters came off the wall one bolt at a time. I spent 10 years teaching children to read, and one of them drew me a heart. One of those things lasts. It is not the one with the ice sculpture. So here is what I need you to hear if there is someone in your life who keeps making you feel small. The people who measure your worth with a scoreboard are telling you everything about themselves and nothing about you. Your value was never theirs to calculate, and the quietest person in the room, the one they overlook, the one they seat by the kitchen doors, is very often the only one who was ever really paying attention. If this story meant something to you, please take a second to like it and share it with someone who has been made to feel small by a person who should have loved them, because they need to hear this today. And subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell because we tell one of these stories about quiet people finding their strength every single time. Tell me in the comments about the moment you finally stopped needing someone's approval, and I will see you in the next one.